The screencast is going to start at central powers versus state powers, so you may already have this depending on what class you're in. So if you've already taken notes on this, you can fast forward to the next section. So we already talked about in class 2 of the issues that need to be resolved at the Constitutional Convention between small states and large states, and then between northern states and southern states, both things regarding representation. The next issue is how big of a central government will the Americans be okay with. We know the articles were weak because the federal government was too weak, but we don't want the central government to be too strong either, to be too similar to what we had with England. So we want to give the central government more power, but how can we prevent it from becoming too powerful? And so hopefully you're thinking about checks and balances at this point. The Americans at the Constitutional Convention decided to enact the separation of powers, meaning they would divide the federal government into 3 separate branches, the legislative, executive, and judicial, and hopefully you remember those from civics. And then there's a system of checks and balances in place where each branch somehow controls or limits another, so that no branch would become too powerful. Now, the Founding Fathers and the framers of the Constitution did establish that the Constitution would be the supreme law of the land, and that it could impose taxes and it could regulate trade, unlike under the Articles of Confederation. And then also it included this necessary and proper clause, which is also known as the elastic clause, which gives the federal government some flexibility to change over time as necessary. So kind of allowing it to grow as needed over time. So we know the Founding Fathers could not have predicted everything that would happen throughout the rest of our country. So the people debate ratification. Ratification referencing approval of the Constitution. The Constitution needed to be ratified by 2/3 of the state's support. They had decided at the beginning of the beginning of the convention. That's 9 out of 13 states. And there were 2 groups early on developing in terms of whether or not people who either approved the Constitution or didn't approve this new form of government. The people who approved the Constitution are considered Federalists, and those who would not support the Constitution were called Anti-Federalists. Now, the Federalist side included men such as James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, and some of these men ended up writing a set of papers called the Federalist Papers that were aimed at getting support for the ratification of the Constitution in the various states. The main issue that the Anti-Federalists have is they feel that the Constitution does not really address any individual rights. They really would like to see a Bill of Rights, a list of individual, rights as citizens somewhere on the Constitution, and that's going to become our first 10 amendments, which are known as the Bill of Rights. When both sides agree to the Bill of Rights, then the Constitution is ratified. So the Bill of Rights is kind of like the final straw, and then the Anti-Federalists decide, okay, we'll give in now. Well, now that we have this brand new branch, or two new branches we didn't have before under the Articles, those being the executive and judicial, you know that we need a president. And the first president will pretty much be unanimously selected as George Washington. No surprise there. And John Adams was George Washington's vice president. And Washington would go on to establish the first chief advisors of our country, and that would be Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton, and the Secretary of War Henry Knox. One of the first things that happened underneath George Washington's presidency is the passing of the Judiciary Act of 1789. While the Constitution did approve of a judicial branch of government, it did not set up the actual court system. So the Judiciary Act of 1789 actually creates the district courts, the appeals courts, and the Supreme Court. We already mentioned the Bill of Rights, but while the men at the convention did agree to it, those amendments take a little bit of time to be officially ratified. As you know, they must go through Congress as well as the states. That happens very quickly under George Washington. Another thing that happens early on in Washington's presidency was the National Bank was established. And there's a lot of controversy behind having a national bank because the Constitution did not mention anything about the bank itself existing. And so this is where we get to battles regarding the interpretation of the Constitution. You have strict constructionists and you have loose constructionists. Strict constructionists would really believe in a strict interpretation of the Constitution, meaning if the Constitution does not say anything about this, then it is not constitutional. And the alternative view is, of course, the loose view is if it doesn't say that it is not able to happen, or if it does not say that it's illegal, then it should be constitutional, not unconstitutional. And Jefferson was a strict constructionist, while Hamilton was a loose one. Alexander Hamilton, will be the biggest proponent of the national bank. And on this issue, both Congress and Washington are going to agree with Hamilton's viewpoint, and the National Bank will be approved through Congress and by President Washington with a 20-year charter, meaning it would come up for vote again 20 years from now. But we're seeing from the beginning kind of this tense relationship between Hamilton and Jefferson develop. You're starting to see those political parties form by the leaders of those two sides of the issue. You see kind of two groups of Federalists. Okay, so obviously in the debate of whether or not the Constitution should be ratified, the Federalists won out. So there's no more really anti-Federalists. If you are, it's irrelevant because we have a Constitution. But within the Federalist group, you kind of have two different factions forming. Northerners, people living in the northern states, tending to support Hamilton, while Southerners tended to support Virginian Jefferson. And it was really based on their views of what America should look like. Obviously, southern states picturing more of, agriculture-based societies, small independent farmers, more states' rights. That was kind of like the Jefferson viewpoint. We'll talk more about political parties throughout this chapter later on. So, the next event we have is our somewhat connection to the French Revolution. It happened some years after the American Revolution, but almost compared to the American Revolution, because soon after our revolution, the French will overthrow the monarchy in France and establish a republic led by Napoleon. The biggest difference here, of course, is that the people are overthrowing the king in the mother country itself. Now, obviously, other monarchs in Europe are looking at France and are not very pleased with this because they're afraid that their own countries would attempt to overthrow their monarchies. So once Napoleon and the people overthrow the French monarchy, Great Britain will go to war against France. Many other European nations go to war against France as well, actually, trying to take down Napoleon. And almost immediately, Washington declares the U.S. as a neutral party. George Washington was never keen on getting involved in foreign affairs. And by declaring neutrality, it means not only are we not going to get physically involved with our military, but we're also going to continue trading with both nations. We're not going to show favoritism on either side. So eventually, we have many of our ships that are en route to Europe being attacked. Mostly by British ships. Essentially, the British would start attacking American ships that were headed to France, saying they had a right to because, the cargo headed to France was aiding their enemy. So they had a right to confiscate that cargo and try to hurt their enemy. But the other thing is, they were stealing or impressing. And that word impressing is spelled how you would imagine impress is spelled, but it does not mean the same thing. The British ships were impressing U.S. sailors, meaning kidnapping them and forcing them to serve in the British Navy, which is a very aggressive action. So, not within the states themselves, but in the ocean, we are once again in conflict with England. And having just gotten out of war with them in the Revolution, Washington does not have any intention of going back to war, but he would like to negotiate peace with England. So he sends John Jay, a American politician, to England to negotiate a peace treaty with the British. And he returns just a few months later with a very controversial treaty, named after him, of course, Jay's Treaty. And this is considered a very big sellout, if I'm being honest. It's kind of seen as a weak treaty on the American side of things. So here's some parts of what the treaty said. According to Jay's Treaty, Britain could confiscate any goods headed to France from any U.S. ship. So right off the get-go, the treaty itself says that England has the right to take ships or to stop ships and confiscate any goods that are headed to France. That right there is strike one. The treaty also did not mention anything about impressment, meaning it did not mention anything about the fact that England needed to stop kidnapping and enlisting American sailors in the British Navy. Another thing that Jay's Treaty said was that Britain had to officially remove all of its troops from America, from all the forts in America, which they were supposed to do per the Treaty of Paris 1783, but it never happened. So, none of these things really seem to address the issue at hand, and the treaty itself says that England's legally allowed to steal American cargo, so that's never good. Very weak treaty. In Washington's farewell address, he will leave after 2 4-year terms in office. He very much sets the precedent for that common time spent in office. You know, now it's an amendment, but it wasn't always, there was no term limits in the beginning. That's not established until the 22nd Amendment. But in his farewell address, he warns against 2 things. One, he warns against political parties. He feels that political parties would just further divide the nation unnecessarily. And he also warns America against getting involved in foreign affairs. In terms of political parties, we're going to ignore that piece of advice from the get-go. And I know when you think about foreign affairs and how many foreign affairs and how many countries America is involved with today, obviously that seems like a joke. We do heed his advice early on, but as of late, we are not listening to Washington anymore. So here are going to be the first 2 political parties we kind of see rise in our country. You had the Federalist Party versus the Democratic Republicans. 2 words you don't often hear together. I'm talking about political parties anyway. So the Federalist side of things represent people like Alexander Hamilton, whereas Thomas Jefferson kind of becomes the leader of the Democratic Republicans. The Federalist Party is made up of mostly Northerners, merchants, wealthy class, and the Democratic Republicans were more of the farming class, people living in the South, as well as people moving and settling westward. It's both southern and westward settlers. And to replace George Washington, John Adams will be the first or the second elected president of the United States. And we will pick up with some of the key events that happened under his presidency in class on Monday. Y'all have a good weekend. Write down any questions if you have any, and I will see y'all Monday.